In the spring of 1851, somewhere along the fertile Black Belt region of central Alabama, a woman named Catherine Hartley walked into her husband's study at 3 in the morning and discovered a scene that would destroy 3 lives forever. What she witnessed that night, documented only in a series of sealed letters held by the Mobile Historical Society until 1924, led to one of the most disturbing acts of revenge ever whispered about in antebellum Southern society. 2 human beings, bound by law and custom to her will, simply vanished from Hartley Plantation within 48 hours. No questions were asked. No authorities were involved. And for nearly 7 decades, the truth of what Catherine Hartley did to her husband and the enslaved man she found him with remained hidden behind the genteel facade of Southern respectability. Before we continue with the story of the Hartley family and the night that shattered their carefully constructed world, if you're listening from Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, or anywhere in the South, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're from. And if stories like this, real human darkness hidden behind history's closed doors, intrigue you, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear, because what we're about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, shame, and vengeance in the Old South. The truth is, what happened at Hartley Plantation wasn't supernatural. It wasn't mysterious in the traditional sense. It was something far more chilling, the calculated cruelty of which human beings are capable when their pride is wounded and their power is absolute. Greene County, Alabama, in the early 1850s was a world unto itself. The Black Belt, named for its dark, rich soil rather than its population, though both definitions would have applied, stretched across the heart of the state like a prosperous wound. Cotton was king, and those who controlled the land and the people who worked it lived like royalty of a particularly American kind. The county seat of Utah was a town of wide streets and narrow mines, where Greek Revival mansions stood as white monuments to wealth built on black labor. Hartley Plantation occupied nearly 2,000 acres along the Tombigbee River, its main house a testament to the family's rise from modest Carolina origins to Alabama aristocracy. Thomas Hartley had purchased the land in 1834, when Alabama was still young and hungry, and over 17 years had transformed it into one of the region's most productive estates. 240 souls lived and worked on Hartley land, men, women, and children whose names appeared in ledgers as assets rather than people, their value calculated in dollars against the columns of cotton production and birth rates. The big house itself was a 2-story structure of white-painted brick, with 6 massive columns supporting a second-floor gallery that wrapped around 3 sides of the building. Inside, the rooms were appointed with furniture shipped from New Orleans and fabrics from as far away as France. Crystal chandeliers hung in the double parlor. Persian carpets covered heart pine floors. A library held more than 400 volumes, though it was unclear how many Thomas Hartley had actually read. Catherine Wilmington Hartley had come to the plantation as a bride in 1842, the 19-year-old daughter of a Charleston shipping merchant who had fallen on hard times. The marriage had been arranged, as most were in their circle, with an eye toward mutual advantage. Thomas needed a wife who could manage a grand household and provide him with heirs. Catherine needed security and status. Love, if it was considered at all, was expected to develop later, a pleasant byproduct of proximity and shared interest. For 9 years, Catherine had performed her role with the precision expected of a woman of her class. She oversaw a staff of 12 house servants, managed the intricate social obligations that came with being mistress of a major plantation, and bore Thomas 2 daughters, Margaret in 1843 and Eleanor in 1846. She maintained the account books with meticulous care, noting every expenditure from dress fabric to field tools. She planned dinners that lasted 5 hours and featured 7 courses. She smiled at her husband across candlelit tables and never complained about the essential loneliness of her position. But Catherine Hartley was not, as her Charleston schooling had intended, an ornament. She was intelligent, observant, and, though she would never have used the word herself, angry. Angry at the limitations of her sex, angry at her dependence, angry at the way power worked in her world. She had learned early to channel that anger into control, and over the years, she had quietly made herself indispensable to the operation of the plantation in ways that went far beyond the traditional mistress's role. She knew every enslaved person by name, age, and skill. She understood the complex web of family relationships in the quarters, She had taught herself basic medicine and personally tended the sick, not out of kindness, but because healthy workers were more productive. She knew which overseers were effective and which were merely cruel. She knew the cotton market as well as any broker in Mobile. And she knew things about her husband that he believed she did not know. Thomas Hartley, at 43, was a man who believed himself to be a success. He had wealth, position, a fine house, and the respect of his peers. He served on the county board of commissioners. He was a deacon at Mesopotamia Baptist Church. His opinions on matters of agriculture and trade were sought and valued. He wore his authority like a second skin, comfortable and unquestioned. But Thomas Hartley had a secret that would have destroyed him if it were known. Not the kind of secret that men like him sometimes kept. A mistress in town, a gambling debt, a disputed land deal. This was something else entirely. Something that in the Alabama of 1851 carried penalties ranging from social death to actual prosecution under the state's sodomy laws. For more than 3 years, Thomas had been involved in a relationship with a man named Jacob, enslaved on the Hartley property since childhood. Jacob was 28 years old in the spring of 1851, a skilled carpenter who worked primarily in maintaining the plantation's extensive buildings and equipment. He was literate, taught to read in secret by his mother, who had learned from the daughter of her previous owner in Virginia, and possessed of a quiet intelligence that Thomas had first noticed when Jacob was barely 20. How it had begun was a question that would never be fully answered. Perhaps Thomas had sought Jacob out, using his absolute authority to coerce what he wanted. Perhaps there had been some moment of mutual recognition, two men trapped in different ways by the same rigid system, finding something in each other that their world said could not exist. The truth likely contained elements of both, complicated by the fundamental impossibility of consent when one person literally owned the other. What was certain was that by 1851 they met regularly in Thomas's study, a ground-floor room at the back of the house that opened onto the garden through French doors. Thomas had given Jacob freedom of movement unusual for an enslaved person, on the pretext of allowing him to check and repair things around the property at any hour. The other enslaved people knew something, of course. It was impossible to keep such things completely hidden in the close quarters of plantation life, but they said nothing. What choice did they have? Catherine had suspected for nearly a year. Not the specific truth, but something. The way Thomas looked at Jacob sometimes. The frequency with which he found reasons to have the man near the house. The gifts, a better coat, a good knife. Privileges that seemed excessive even for a valued skilled worker. But suspicion was not certainty, and Catherine was a woman who dealt in facts. On the night of May 6, 1851, those facts arrived. O evento sombrio. Catherine had gone to bed at 10 o'clock, as was her custom. Thomas had remained in his study, claiming paperwork that needed his attention. This too was normal. He often worked late into the night, especially during the planting and harvest seasons. Catherine had read for an hour by lamplight, then extinguished the flame and settled into sleep with the ease of someone whose conscience, if not entirely clear, was at least unburdened by doubt about her own righteousness. She woke at 3 in the morning, needing to use the chamber pot, and noticed immediately that Thomas's side of the bed had not been slept in. Again, not unprecedented. He sometimes fell asleep at his desk or, if he'd been drinking, on the settee in his study. But something made Catherine rise, pull a wrapper over her nightgown, and move silently down the hallway toward the stairs. The house at that hour was a study in contrasts. Moonlight through tall windows, creating rectangles of blue-white light against shadow. The tick of the tall case clock in the entrance hall marking time with mechanical indifference. The smell of wood ash from the day's fires still lingering in the air. Catherine moved without her shoes, her bare feet silent on the polished wood. As she descended the stairs, she heard it, a sound that at first her mind refused to interpret correctly. Low voices from the study, masculine voices, speaking in tones that were intimate rather than conversational. And then a sound that was unmistakable, a gasp of pleasure that could mean only one thing. Catherine stood frozen on the bottom step for perhaps 30 seconds, her hand gripping the newel post so tightly that her knuckles went white. Later, trying to reconstruct that moment, she would remember thinking very clearly, I can turn around. I can go back upstairs. I can never know for certain. But she was not a woman who could live with uncertainty. Not when the truth was just 20 feet away behind a closed door. She crossed the entrance hall and put her hand on the brass knob of the study door. It turned silently. Thomas kept all the hinges and locks in the house well oiled, a habit from his own father. She pushed the door open perhaps 6 inches, enough to see into the room. The lamp on Thomas's desk was turned low, casting a golden light that made the scene look like something from a painting, classical, almost beautiful in its composition. Thomas was seated in his leather chair, his head tilted back, his eyes closed. Jacob knelt before him, his dark skin gilded by the lamplight, his hands on Thomas's knees. What they were doing was absolutely clear, undeniable, impossible to interpret as anything other than what it was. Catherine watched for perhaps 15 seconds. Neither man knew she was there. Then she pulled the door shut, again silently, and turned and walked back across the entrance hall, up the stairs, down the corridor to her room. She closed and locked her bedroom door, sat down on the edge of her bed, and began, very methodically, to plan. The rage came later, once the initial shock had worn off. It built slowly through what remained of the night, fed by humiliation and betrayal, but also by something darker. A profound sense of violation that had as much to do with power as it did with marriage. Catherine Hartley had built her life around understanding and accepting her place in the rigid hierarchy of Southern society. She was a woman, subordinate to men but superior to slaves. She was a wife, bound to her husband but mistress of her household. These rules were absolute, sacred, the very foundation of her world. What she had witnessed shattered those rules. Her husband, who by law and custom had authority over her, had debased himself with a man who by law and custom was property. The transgression was double, against nature as their society defined it, and against the racial order that made their entire way of life possible. If a white man could desire a black man, could place himself in a position of apparent submission to someone who was legally a slave, then what did that say about the natural hierarchy that justified everything? More personally, more painfully, Catherine understood with sudden clarity that she had been replaced, not by another woman, which would have been commonplace and forgivable, but by a man, and not just any man, but an enslaved man. Her husband had chosen him over her, had risked everything, reputation, position, possibly even freedom, to be with him. What did that make her? What did that make their marriage, their children, their entire shared life? By the time grey light began to show at the windows, Catherine had made her decision. It was not made in haste or passion, though both emotions were present. It was made with the cold calculation that had always been her greatest strength. She would not confront Thomas. She would not make a scene. She would not divorce him. Even if the scandal could be contained enough to allow it, divorce would leave her penniless and powerless, dependent on her father who had nothing left to give. She would not expose him to the law or to public judgment. No, Catherine Hartley would do something else entirely. Something that would serve multiple purposes. It would remove the offense from her sight. It would punish both men in a way that fit their crime. And it would be done so quietly that no one would ever know the real reason. She would make them both disappear, separately but together, in a way that would destroy them while preserving her own position. She knew exactly how to do it. The question was only whether she had the courage or the cruelty to follow through. The institution of slavery in the antebellum South was built on the principle of absolute power over other human beings. Enslaved people could be bought, sold, traded, given away, or willed to heirs like any other property. They had no legal recourse, no protection from separation from family, no say in their own fate. This was the system that Catherine Hartley had lived within all her life, that she had accepted without question as natural and divinely ordained. Now she would use that system to exact her revenge. The morning of May 7th proceeded with absolute normalcy. Catherine dressed with her usual care, supervised breakfast, spoke pleasantly to her daughters about their lessons for the day. Thomas appeared at the breakfast table at 8 o'clock, looking perhaps slightly tired but otherwise unremarkable. He kissed his wife's cheek. He asked about her plans for the day. If he had any idea that she had seen him the night before, he gave no sign. Catherine watched him eat his eggs and ham, drink his coffee, read through the mobile register that arrived by mail twice a week. She responded to his comments with her usual measured interest. She poured him a second cup of coffee. And all the while, behind her composed face, she was refining her plan, considering angles, anticipating problems. The key was to act quickly before doubt or mercy could interfere. The key was to make it look like routine business. The key was to ensure that neither man ever had the chance to speak to the other, to coordinate stories, to resist. At 9:30, Catherine excused herself from the morning room and went to find the overseer, a man named Rutledge who had worked for the Hartleys for 6 years. She found him near the stables, discussing the day's work with 2 of the field drivers. "Mr. Rutledge," Catherine said, her voice carrying the tone of pleasant authority that she had perfected over years of managing a large household. "I need Jacob brought to the house. There's extensive damage to the window frames in the east parlor. I believe we have carpenter ants, and I want it assessed and repaired before it worsens." Rutledge touched his hat. "Yes, ma'am. I'll send him up directly." "Actually," Catherine said, as if the thought had just occurred to her, "have him come to the back entrance. No need to track through the front rooms if the work is all to be done on the east side." 20 minutes later, Jacob arrived at the back door carrying his toolbox. He was a tall man, lean and strong from years of physical labor, with intelligent eyes that had learned to reveal nothing. He had been born on Hartley property, son of a woman named Rachel, who worked in the kitchen gardens. His father had been sold away before Jacob was old enough to remember him, a common enough story. Jacob had learned carpentry from an older, enslaved man named Samuel, now dead, and had become skilled enough that Thomas relied on him for all manner of repairs and improvements. What Jacob felt about Thomas, what he felt about their encounters in the study, was something he kept buried so deep that perhaps even he could not fully access it. Survival in his position meant accepting certain realities. It meant taking whatever small advantages came his way. It meant never allowing himself to fully think about what it would be like to be free, to make his own choices, to love whom he wanted without the shadow of ownership over everything. Catherine met him at the back door herself, which was unusual. Normally, such interactions would be handled by the housekeeper or one of the other house servants. "Jacob," she said, her voice perfectly pleasant, "there's been a change of plans. I need you to take a message to Mr. Turnbull in Utah. It concerns some furniture I've ordered. He was supposed to send word when it arrived, but I haven't heard, and I want to check on the status." Jacob hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Taking messages to town was not normally his responsibility, but he was not in a position to question the mistress's orders. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "The wagon is ready for you in the drive," Catherine continued. "I've already had your tools loaded. You'll need to stop at the Dennison farm on your way back and assess some work they want done. I told Mrs. Dennison you might be able to fit them in next week." This made more sense. Jacob was occasionally hired out to other plantations for skilled work, with his wages going to Thomas. He nodded, accepting the explanation. What Jacob did not know was that the wagon driver was not one of the regular Hartley people. He was a man named Pierce, hired 3 days earlier from a neighboring plantation, who had been paid extra and given very specific instructions. He did not know that the message Jacob carried was sealed and addressed to a man in Utah who worked as an agent for several of the larger slave trading firms in Mobile. And he did not know that once the wagon left Hartley property, he would never return to it. Catherine watched the wagon pull away. Jacob seated beside Pierce, the morning sun already hot enough to make the dust of the drive shimmer in the air. She felt nothing, no guilt, no doubt, no mercy. Just a cold satisfaction that the first part of her plan had been executed. Now for the second. She waited until she saw Thomas heading toward the fields for his morning inspection, another routine that could be counted on. Then she returned to the house and went directly to his study. She locked the door behind her, went to his desk, and took out the leather-bound ledger where he kept records of all the plantation's enslaved people. She found the page for Jacob quickly enough. Age 28, carpenter, healthy, valued at $1,200, born on property, mother Rachel, deceased 1847, no recorded father. Below that, in Thomas's handwriting, were the words, "Not to be sold, essential to plantation operations." Catherine took up Thomas's pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and with 3 strokes crossed out those words. In their place, she wrote, "Sold to Turnbull and Associates, Utah, May 7th, 1851, $1,200. The forgery was perfect. She had been keeping her husband's books for 9 years. She knew every loop and slant of his handwriting. The transaction that took place in Utah that afternoon of May 7th, 1851 was, on its surface, utterly ordinary. Jacob was presented to Mr. Turnbull by Pierce, along with a letter bearing Thomas Hartley's signature, forged by Catherine, explaining that circumstances had forced an unexpected sale and that the transaction should be handled with all due speed. Cash payment was acceptable. Mr. Turnbull, a sharp-eyed man who had been in the trading business for 15 years and had seen every variation of human desperation and calculation, examined Jacob with the practiced eye of someone assessing livestock. He checked Jacob's teeth, his hands for signs of disease, asked him questions about his skills. Jacob answered numbly, still trying to understand what was happening, how he had gone from taking a message to being sold in the space of a single wagon ride. He tried to explain. "There's been a mistake. Mr. Hartley, he wouldn't sell me. He needs me for the carpentry work. You need to send word to the plantation." Turnbull had heard such protests 1,000 times. Everyone thought they were special, that their owner valued them too much to sell them. They never understood that in the end they were all just commodities, and circumstances changed. "Boy," Turnbull said not unkindly, "I have a letter here with your master's signature and seal. I have authorization for payment. This is legal and proper, and I'll thank you not to make a fuss about it." Jacob was taken to the back room of Turnbull's offices, where 3 other enslaved people, 2 men and a woman, sat chained to a wall, waiting to be transported to Mobile. He was shackled alongside them. The door was locked. And there, in the dimness of that hot room, with the sounds of Utah's daily commerce filtering through the walls, Jacob began to understand that his life had just fundamentally changed, that whatever he had thought he had with Thomas was not protection, was not safety, meant nothing against the absolute power of ownership. But he did not yet understand the full depth of what had been done to him. That same afternoon, Catherine waited until Thomas returned from the fields, until he had washed and changed for dinner, until the family was seated at the table, with the girls chattering about their day. Then, as the first course was being served, she said casually, "Thomas, I handled some business for you today. You've been so busy with the planting, and I know you've been concerned about our cash reserves." Thomas looked up from his soup, attentive but not alarmed. Catherine often handled business matters. "I sold Jacob to Turnbull in town," Catherine continued, her voice perfectly level. "Got $1,200 for him, full value. The money's in your desk. I thought we could use it to make that payment to Merit for the seed we bought on credit." The color drained from Thomas's face. His spoon clattered against his bowl. For a moment he seemed unable to speak. "You... what?" he finally managed. "I sold Jacob," Catherine repeated, meeting her husband's eyes directly. "You've been saying we needed to liquidate some assets. He's skilled enough to command top price, and we have other carpenters in the quarters who can take on his work." It seemed the practical choice. Thomas stood up so abruptly that his chair fell backwards. "You had no right. You can't just... I never authorized." "I'm your wife," Catherine said, still in that same calm tone. "I manage the household, which includes the household accounts. You've given me signing authority on plantation business many times before. I used your seal. Everything was legal and proper." "Where is he?" Thomas demanded. "I'll go to Turnbull right now. I'll cancel the sale. Turnbull planned to put him on the evening barge to Mobile," Catherine said. "That departed 2 hours ago. By now, Jacob is halfway down the Tombigbee River. But if you'd like to ride to Mobile and try to track him down, by all means do so. I'm sure Mr. Turnbull can tell you which firm he sold him on to. There are only about 40 slave dealers operating in Mobile. It shouldn't take you more than a few days to check them all." She paused, then added very softly, "Of course, you'll need to explain why you're so desperate to get him back. I'm sure people will be very curious about why one carpenter is so irreplaceable." Thomas stood there, trembling with a rage and despair that he could not express, not in front of his daughters, not in front of the house servants who stood by the walls waiting to clear dishes. He understood in that moment that Catherine knew. He did not know how much she knew, but she knew enough, and she had used the very system that gave him absolute power over Jacob to take that power away. "Excuse me," he said, his voice strangled. "I'm not feeling well." He left the dining room. Catherine heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard the door to his study slam. She turned to her daughters, who were watching with wide, confused eyes. "Your father is overtired from the planting," she said pleasantly. "Now, tell me more about what you learned in your French lesson today." But Catherine's revenge was not complete. Not yet. Because while Jacob had been sold to Turnbull that afternoon, he had not been put on a barge to Mobile. That was a lie, calculated to prevent Thomas from attempting an immediate pursuit. Jacob was still in Utah, locked in Turnbull's holding room. And that evening, after the office had closed and the streets had quieted, Turnbull received another visitor. Her name was Viola Garrison, though she had not used that surname in many years. She operated an establishment in Mobile's theater district, a brothel catering to a specific and highly discreet clientele. While most such houses in Mobile served the appetites of wealthy white men for enslaved or free women of color, Viola's establishment offered something different: enslaved men, available for the use of male clients. It was illegal, of course, like all sodomy in Alabama. But it was profitable, and as long as it remained discreet, as long as the right officials were paid to look the other way, it was tolerated. Viola purchased enslaved men from a variety of sources, sometimes from traders who had men damaged in some way that made them less valuable for fieldwork. Sometimes from owners who suspected their male slaves of tendencies that made them dangerous to keep on a plantation. And sometimes from special arrangements, like the one she had with Mr. Turnbull, who contacted her when he came into possession of men who fit her specific requirements. The arrangement Viola had made for Jacob had been negotiated 3 days earlier, in a meeting with a woman who had traveled to Mobile under an assumed name. The woman had been very specific about what she wanted: a particular enslaved man, purchased and placed in a particular situation. She had been willing to pay handsomely for this service, not just the purchase price, but a substantial fee on top of it. Viola had asked no questions about motivation. She did not need to. Women who made such arrangements usually had good reasons, and those reasons were not her concern. On the evening of May 7th, Viola paid Turnbull $200 for Jacob, plus his fee for facilitating the transaction. Jacob was loaded into a closed wagon and transported to Mobile, a journey of about 60 miles that would take the better part of a day and a night. He was given water but no explanation. He was kept chained. And when the wagon finally stopped and he was led into a building in Mobile, he found himself in a place that at first he could not quite comprehend. It looked like a house, a large townhouse in one of Mobile's better neighborhoods. But the windows were covered with heavy curtains. The rooms were furnished in a way that was both opulent and somehow tawdry. And there were other men there, enslaved men, who looked at him with expressions that contained pity and a kind of weary recognition. One of them, a man named Samuel, who had been there for 2 years, explained it to Jacob that first night. Explained what the house was. Explained what was expected of them. Explained that resistance was pointless, that the men who came there paid well for their pleasures and had no mercy for slaves who refused to cooperate. Jacob listened, understanding slowly, filtering through his shock and exhaustion. Catherine Hartley had not just sold him. She had not just separated him from Thomas. She had sent him to a place where what he had done in private with a man he had some connection to, however complicated and compromised that connection was, would be forced upon him again and again with strangers. Where the thing that in their quiet moments in the study had perhaps contained some fragment of intimacy, however poisoned by the fundamental inequality between them, would become purely transactional, purely degrading. It was a punishment that fit the crime perfectly, at least in Catherine's mind. If Jacob and Thomas wanted to engage in such acts, then Jacob would do so endlessly, with anyone who paid, stripped of all pretense of choice or connection. But Catherine was not finished. The final piece of her revenge was still to come. Thomas Hartley spent the next week in a state of controlled desperation. He could not ride to Mobile and search for Jacob. To do so would require explaining why one enslaved carpenter mattered so much. He could not confront his wife directly about what she had done, because to do so would require admitting what she had witnessed. He was trapped in his own secret, pinned by the very shame that had kept him silent all along. He tried to function normally. He oversaw the fields. He attended to business. He spoke to his wife with icy politeness. But inside, he was unraveling. The shock of Jacob's sudden absence was compounded by the realization of how completely Catherine had outmaneuvered him. She held all the power now. She knew his secret, and with a word, she could destroy him utterly. On May 14th, exactly 1 week after Jacob's sale, Catherine came to Thomas's study after dinner. She closed the door behind her and stood looking at her husband, who sat at his desk with a glass of whiskey, his third of the evening. "I've been thinking," Catherine said, "about our situation, about the future of this family." Thomas said nothing. He could not look at her. "I will never speak of what I know," Catherine continued. "I will never expose you. Our marriage will continue as it has, at least in outward appearance. You will fulfill your duties as husband and father. I will fulfill mine as wife and mother. No one need ever know that anything has changed." "Where did you send him?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "At least tell me that. Is he well? Is he safe?" "He is alive," Catherine said. "That is all you need to know, and it is more than you deserve." She moved toward the door, then paused. "There is one more thing. I've decided we need an overseer with more experience, someone who can take on more of the day-to-day management. I've arranged for Mr. Rutledge to be replaced. His replacement arrives tomorrow." Thomas looked up at her, confused by this apparent non sequitur. "The new overseer's name is Pierce," Catherine said. "You may remember him. He drove the wagon that took Jacob to town. I've purchased his contract from the Danforth Plantation. He'll be living in the overseer's house, and I expect you to give him full authority over all plantation operations." The threat was implicit but clear. Pierce had been part of the plot to remove Jacob. He knew something, even if not everything. He was Catherine's man, loyal to her, watching Thomas. It was another chain, another form of control. "You've thought of everything," Thomas said bitterly. "Yes," Catherine replied. "I have." She left him alone in his study, surrounded by his books and his maps and his ledgers, in the room where he had committed the sin that had cost him everything. And for the first time in his adult life, Thomas Hartley wept. But Catherine's plan had one element that even she had not fully anticipated, the human capacity for obsession. Because Thomas, for all his shock and grief, was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He had built his entire life on the principle of control over land, over labor, over his own carefully constructed public image. The idea that Catherine had simply won, that Jacob was gone forever and there was nothing to be done about it, was intolerable. Over the following days, Thomas began to investigate quietly. He wrote to contacts in Mobile under various pretexts, asking about the slave markets, about recent sales, about where a skilled carpenter from Greene County might have ended up. He spoke to traveling merchants who passed through Utah. He even, in a moment of particular desperation, considered hiring a slave catcher to simply track Jacob down, though he quickly realized the impossibility of explaining such a request. What Thomas was looking for, though he could not have articulated it clearly even to himself, was not just Jacob. It was the restoration of his sense of power, his sense of control. Catherine had humiliated him by revealing that his secret made him weak, made him vulnerable. If he could find Jacob, if he could somehow undo what Catherine had done, he could reclaim that power. By the end of May, Thomas had pieced together enough information to know that Jacob had been purchased by a woman named Viola Garrison, who operated some kind of boarding house in Mobile. He did not yet know what kind of boarding house, but he knew the address. And on the morning of June 2nd, 1851, Thomas told Catherine that he had business in Mobile that would require him to be gone for several days. Catherine watched him depart with a cold satisfaction. She knew where he was going, of course. She had known he would go eventually. Men like Thomas always believed they could fix things, could reassert control, could undo the consequences of their own actions. She had counted on this. What happened when Thomas Hartley arrived in Mobile and found his way to Viola Garrison's establishment on Front Street would become the final act of Catherine's carefully constructed revenge. Mobile in 1851 was a city of sharp contrasts. The waterfront bustled with commerce, cotton bales stacked high on the docks, ships from around the world crowded into the harbor, merchants and laborers and sailors moving in a constant swirl of activity. A few blocks inland, the theater district offered a different kind of commerce, one conducted in shadows and whispers. Gambling houses, saloons and brothels of various kinds operated openly enough to be known, but discreetly enough to maintain a veneer of deniability. Viola Garrison's house at 47 Front Street was a 3-story brick building with black shutters and a small brass plate by the door that read simply, "The Garrison House." Nothing about its exterior suggested its true purpose. It could have been a respectable boarding house or a merchant's residence. That was entirely intentional. Thomas Hartley arrived on the evening of June the 2nd, after a hard day's ride that had left him exhausted and covered in dust. He had taken the morning coach from Utah to Demopolis, then hired a horse for the remaining journey to Mobile, a circuitous route designed to avoid anyone who might recognize him and question his purpose. The journey had given him far too much time to think, to imagine what he might find, to rehearse conversations that he knew, even then, were unlikely to go as he hoped. He checked into a hotel on Royal Street under an assumed name, John Thompson of Montgomery, paying in advance with coins rather than a letter of credit that might be traced back to Greene County. The room was small and spare, with a narrow bed and a washstand, its single window overlooking an alley where cats fought over scraps. Thomas washed the dust from his face and hands, changed his shirt, and spent nearly an hour sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to steady his nerves. The enormity of what he was doing had begun to settle on him during the journey. He had abandoned his plantation at the height of the growing season, left Catherine without explanation, traveled to a city where he knew almost no one, all to pursue a man he had no legal right to reclaim. If anyone in Greene County discovered where he had gone and why, the scandal would be immediate and absolute. But the alternative, accepting that Jacob was simply gone, that Catherine had won so completely, was impossible to bear. As twilight deepened into night, Thomas finally left the hotel and made his way toward Front Street. The city transformed after dark. Respectable citizens retreated to their homes, and a different population emerged. Sailors looking for entertainment, merchants seeking pleasures they could not pursue in daylight, men of all classes drawn to the district's hidden offerings. Thomas moved among them feeling utterly alien, a planter from the countryside navigating an urban underworld he barely understood. He found the address easily enough. He had it written on a slip of paper that he'd consulted at least a dozen times during the journey. But now that he stood across the street from the building, looking at its shuttered windows and unmarked door, Thomas felt the first real stirrings of doubt. What exactly was he going to do? Walk up and demand Jacob back? On what grounds? With what authority? He was no longer Jacob's legal owner. Catherine had seen to that. He was just a stranger with an obsession he could not explain to anyone. He was still standing there, paralyzed by indecision, when the front door opened and a man emerged, a well-dressed gentleman of perhaps 50, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The man looked around carefully, his eyes scanning the street in both directions before descending the steps and walking briskly away into the darkness. Something about his manner, the way he had checked to ensure no one was watching, the slight adjustment of his collar as though to hide his face, confirmed Thomas's growing suspicion that this was not any ordinary boarding house. Thomas waited until the street was empty except for a drunk sleeping against a wall 2 buildings down, then crossed and climbed the steps. The door was solid oak, painted black, with a brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head. He knocked twice, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet street. A viewing panel in the door slid open, revealing a pair of eyes that assessed him quickly, taking in his clothes, his bearing, his apparent nervousness. "Yes, I'm looking for Mrs. Garrison," Thomas said, keeping his voice low. "I have business to discuss with her regarding a recent acquisition." There was a pause during which Thomas felt those eyes measuring him, determining whether he was a threat, a potential customer, or something else entirely. Then the sound of locks being turned, 3 of them, he counted, and the door opened just wide enough to admit him. Thomas found himself in a dim entrance hall lit by a single gas lamp turned low. The walls were papered in dark red, and the floor was polished wood partially covered by an oriental carpet. The man who had opened the door, large, muscular, clearly serving as both doorman and security, gestured for Thomas to wait, then disappeared through a door to the left. Standing alone in that hallway, Thomas became acutely aware of sounds from deeper in the building. Music, faint and muffled, a piano being played somewhere on an upper floor. Voices, laughter, the creak of floorboards, and underneath it all a quality of atmosphere that was unmistakable once recognized, the particular energy of a place where intimate transactions were being conducted for money. The doorman returned and gestured for Thomas to follow. They went through the door on the left, down another hallway papered in gold silk with paintings of pastoral scenes that seemed grotesquely inappropriate given the house's true purpose, and finally into a well-appointed parlor where a woman sat behind an ornate mahogany desk. Viola Garrison was perhaps 45, handsome rather than beautiful, with dark hair pulled back in a severe style and sharp features that suggested both intelligence and a certain hardness born of experience. She was dressed in a dark green silk gown that was expensive but not flashy. with a simple cameo at her throat, the costume of a respectable widow, which was indeed how she presented herself to the wider mobile society. Her eyes, when they met Thomas's, were shrewd and calculating, the eyes of someone who had seen every variety of human weakness and knew how to profit from it. "Mr. Thompson, is it?" she said, her voice cultured with a trace of a Virginia accent. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "My doorman says you wish to discuss an acquisition. I'm not sure what you mean. I run a boarding house for gentlemen, nothing more." Thomas sat, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "We both know that isn't true, Mrs. Garrison. And we both know that I wouldn't be here if I believed it was. You purchased a man named Jacob from a trader in Utah approximately 4 weeks ago. I want him back. I'm prepared to pay whatever price you require." Viola studied him for a long moment, her face revealing nothing. Then she opened a drawer in her desk, withdrew a leather-bound ledger, and flipped through several pages. "I purchase many men from many traders, Mr. Thompson. I'm afraid you'll need to be more specific." "He's 28 years old," Thomas said, hearing the desperation creeping into his own voice and hating himself for it. "Skilled carpenter, originally from Hartley Plantation in Greene County. Tall, strong, literate. I have reason to believe he's here, in this house." "Ah," Viola said, her finger stopping on a page in the ledger. "That one." She leaned back in her chair, closing the book with a soft thud. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Mr. Thompson. Or should I say Mr. Hartley? Yes, I thought so. The man you're looking for is not for sale." "Everything is for sale," Thomas said. "Name your price. I'll pay double what you gave, triple. I have access to considerable funds." "You misunderstand," Viola replied, her tone patient but firm. "When I say he's not for sale, I don't mean the price isn't right. I mean that a specific arrangement was made when I purchased him. An arrangement that includes explicit terms prohibiting his resale to anyone connected with his previous ownership. The woman who facilitated the purchase, who paid a substantial premium to ensure these terms were honored, was very clear about that." The blood drained from Thomas's face. "Woman? What woman?" Viola smiled slightly, the expression not quite reaching her eyes. "I think you know the answer to that question, Mr. Hartley. And I think you know that coming here was pointless. But if you'd like to understand exactly what situation you're in, I can arrange for you to see him. Not to speak to him, you understand. The terms of my arrangement forbid any contact, but to see, to observe. Some men find that helpful in achieving closure." Every instinct Thomas possessed told him to leave, to walk out of that house and ride back to Greene County and try to salvage what remained of his life, to accept defeat and move forward as best he could. But the obsession that had driven him to Mobile, that had consumed him for the past month, would not permit retreat. He needed to see Jacob, needed to confirm that this was real, needed to understand the full extent of what Catherine had done. "Show me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Viola rang a small bell on her desk. The large doorman reappeared immediately, as though he had been waiting just outside. "Take Mr. Hartley to the viewing room," she said. "Let him watch through the panel for 10 minutes. Make sure he understands he is not to interfere, not to make any sound, not to attempt any contact. If he violates these terms, he is to be removed from the premises immediately." Thomas was led back into the hallway, up a flight of stairs covered in thick carpet that muffled their footsteps, and down a corridor lined with closed doors, behind which Thomas could hear various sounds, voices, movement, the rhythmic creak of bed frames. The doorman stopped at a door near the end of the hall, unlocked it, and gestured for Thomas to enter. The room was barely larger than a closet, perhaps 6 feet by 4, with no furniture except a small stool. One wall had a panel that could be slid aside to reveal a window, or more accurately a pane of one-way glass, looking into the adjacent room. The glass was thick, slightly warped in a way that suggested it had been specially made for this purpose. Those inside the next room could not see out, would have no idea they were being observed. The doorman slid the panel open. 10 minutes, he said, his voice flat and professional. "Don't make a sound, don't touch the glass. When I come back, you leave immediately, understand?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak. The doorman left, closing the door behind him. Thomas heard the key turn in the lock. He was being kept in as much as others were being kept out. Then he turned to the window and looked through into a bedroom that was both luxurious and somehow nightmarish in its implications. The room was larger than the viewing closet, perhaps 15 feet square, decorated in a style that seemed designed to evoke sensuality. Red wallpaper with a pattern of gold fleur-de-lis, a large four-poster bed with crimson covers, and an excess of pillows. Heavy curtains drawn across windows that Thomas suspected were sealed or barred. Gas lamps turned low, casting everything in a golden-red glow that made the scene look like something from a fever dream. A washstand in the corner with a porcelain basin and pitcher, a wardrobe against one wall, and various other items whose purposes Thomas tried not to think about. The room was occupied. A white man of perhaps 50, balding, with the soft body of someone who had spent his life behind a desk or counter, sat on the edge of the bed removing his shoes, and standing near the washstand, his back to the glass, was Jacob. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He had prepared himself to see Jacob, had thought he was ready for it, but the reality was like a physical blow. Jacob was thinner than Thomas remembered, his shoulders somehow more angular, his movements more careful. He wore only a pair of cotton trousers, his torso bare, and even from behind Thomas could see a new tension in the way he held himself. Not the easy confidence of a skilled craftsman sure of his value, but something more guarded, more defeated. The white man said something Thomas couldn't hear through the thick glass. Jacob turned, and Thomas saw his face for the first time in a month. The change was stunning. Jacob's features were the same, but everything about his expression had altered. Where there had been intelligence and a kind of quiet dignity, there was now only a careful blankness. The expression of someone who had learned to absent himself mentally from whatever his body was being required to do. His eyes, which Thomas remembered as alert and alive, were flat, dead, looking at the white man on the bed without really seeing him. The white man gestured, apparently giving an instruction. Jacob moved toward the bed with a mechanical quality that made Thomas's stomach turn. There was no hesitation. Jacob clearly knew what was expected, had done this before, perhaps many times in the month since Catherine had sent him here. But there was also no volition, no choice. Just the movement of a body that had been trained to obey, to perform, to service whoever had paid for the privilege. What Thomas witnessed over the next 10 minutes was something he would never be able to fully process or forget. Jacob servicing the white man with a practiced efficiency that spoke of repetition and training. The white man's hands on Jacob's body, proprietary and careless, touching him as one might touch an object. Jacob's face throughout remaining blank, absent, present only in the physical sense, while clearly removed in every way that mattered. It was not lovemaking. It was not even desire in any recognizable form. It was work, degrading and dehumanizing work, and Jacob performed it with the same resignation that an enslaved person in a cotton field might pick bowls under an overseer's whip, or a house servant might empty chamber pots, necessary labor to avoid punishment, done without any expectation of dignity or consideration. Thomas wanted to look away, but found he could not. Some part of him needed to witness this, needed to understand what Catherine had done, because what they had shared, compromised and unequal as it was, shaped by the fundamental impossibility of consent between owner and owned, had at least occurred in private, in moments stolen from their other lives, containing perhaps some small fragment of connection, however poisoned by power imbalance. What Thomas saw through the glass was that same physical act, stripped of all pretense, mechanized, commercialized, repeated endlessly with strangers who paid for the privilege of using Jacob's body however they wished. This was Catherine's revenge. She had not just separated them. She had not just sold Jacob away. She had taken what they had done together and turned it into this. She had made Jacob into a commodity being used by men he did not know, over and over, night after night. And she had ensured that Thomas would know about it, would be able to find out, would eventually stand exactly where he was standing now, and see exactly what he was seeing. The door behind Thomas unlocked. The doorman had returned. "Time's up," he said, his voice neither kind nor unkind, simply professional. Thomas stumbled back from the window, his legs barely supporting him. The panel was slid closed, blocking his view of the bedroom and its occupants. He was escorted out of the viewing room, back down the hallway with its muffled sounds, down the stairs, back to Viola's parlor. She looked up as he entered, her expression suggesting she had seen this reaction before. "Now you understand," she said, gesturing for him to sit. Thomas remained standing, swaying slightly. "The woman who arranged this wanted you to know. That's why she gave me your description, told me you would likely come looking eventually." She wanted you to see exactly what she had done and why you can never undo it. How do I end this? Thomas asked, his voice breaking. There must be a way. How do I get him out of here? You don't, Viola said simply. She opened her ledger again, turned to a specific page and read from it. The arrangement was very clear, Mr. Hartley. If you or anyone connected to you, family, friends, agents, attempts to purchase him, if you contact the authorities, if you make any trouble at all, certain information will be provided to very interested parties. Information about why you're so desperate to reclaim this particular slave. Documentation, if you will. Your wife was quite thorough in her preparations. Thomas felt the room tilt around him. Documentation? Letters, Viola said, written in your hand to Jacob, found in your study, apparently. Your wife has them in safekeeping, along with a full account of what she witnessed. If you attempt to interfere with the arrangement she has made, these documents will be delivered to the district attorney, to your pastor, to the newspaper, to anyone who might find them interesting. I believe you understand what that would mean for you. Thomas understood. He understood perfectly. In Alabama in 1851, the crime of sodomy carried a sentence of up to 10 years at hard labor. But before any legal consequences could be pursued, the social consequences would destroy him. He would be denounced from every pulpit, ostracized from every drawing room, removed from every position of authority. His daughters would be unmarriageable, tainted by association. His business relationships would dissolve. He would lose everything: property, position, family, freedom, everything that made him who he was. Catherine had not just trapped Jacob, she had trapped Thomas as well. If he tried to free Jacob, he would have to destroy himself first. And she had known that from the beginning, had planned for it, had prepared every detail of this revenge with the same meticulous care she brought to managing the plantation's accounts. How long? Thomas asked, his voice hollow. How long is the arrangement? Viola consulted her ledger again. Your wife paid for 20 years of service in advance. That takes us to 1871. After that, if he survives... She paused, seeming to consider whether to continue. If he survives, I'm to sell him to Beaumont Sugar Works in Louisiana. Your wife was very specific about that destination. I understand their labor requirements are quite demanding. The sugar plantations were notorious as death sentences. The work was brutally hard, cutting cane in swampy conditions, feeding the grinders, working in the refineries with their clouds of caustic steam. Enslaved people sent to sugar plantations rarely lasted more than a few years. It was where owners sent slaves they wanted to punish or to die. Catherine had planned for Jacob's destruction to continue even after his time at the garrison house ended. There is one more thing you should understand, Viola said. And now there was something in her voice that might have been sympathy, or might have been simply the satisfaction of delivering a final blow. Your wife visits Mobile twice a year, Mr. Hartley. She stays at the Waverly Hotel, conducts various business, and during each visit, she comes here. She doesn't see him, but I provide her with a report. How he's doing, how many clients he's served, whether he's remained healthy and compliant. She seems to take considerable satisfaction in these reports. The image of Catherine sitting in this same parlor, listening to accounts of Jacob's degradation, taking notes perhaps in her precise handwriting, was almost more than Thomas could bear. This wasn't passive revenge, punishment enacted and then forgotten. Catherine was actively maintaining it, checking on it, ensuring it continued exactly as she had designed it. Why are you telling me this? Thomas asked. Because your wife paid me to, Viola replied matter-of-factly. Part of our arrangement is that if you came looking, I was to tell you everything. She wanted you to know not just what she had done, but that she continues to do it, that she thinks about it, that your suffering gives her pleasure. I'm simply fulfilling the terms of our contract. Thomas walked toward the door, his legs moving automatically while his mind struggled to process what he had learned. Viola made no move to stop him. The doorman appeared to escort him out, through the red-papered hallway, through the entrance hall, and finally to the front door. Just before he stepped out into the night, Thomas turned back. Is there any kindness in this place? Any mercy at all? The doorman's expression didn't change. There's efficiency, sir. There's order. Kindness and mercy aren't part of what gets purchased here. The door closed behind Thomas with a soft final click. Thomas Hartley walked through the mobile night with no clear destination, his mind unable to form coherent thoughts beyond the images burned into his memory. He found himself at the waterfront without remembering how he got there, standing on a dock while the dark water of the bay lapped at the pilings below. Ships' lights bobbed in the harbor. Somewhere in the darkness, a man was singing a work song in a language Thomas didn't recognize. The world continued, indifferent to his suffering. He stood there for nearly an hour, and during that time, a terrible clarity settled over him. He could not save Jacob. He could not undo what Catherine had done. He could not even speak of it to anyone, not a lawyer, not a friend, not even a minister, because to explain would require confession, and confession would mean destruction. Catherine had designed her revenge perfectly, trapping both of them in a situation that had no escape. Thomas returned to his hotel as dawn was breaking, crawled into bed fully clothed, and lay staring at the ceiling as sunlight slowly filled the room. He did not sleep. He did not weep. He simply existed in a state of numb horror, replaying everything he had seen and learned, understanding that this was now his reality and would remain so for the next 20 years, until Jacob was finally sent to Louisiana to die among the cane fields. The journey back to Greene County took 2 days. Thomas moved through it mechanically, coached to Demopolis, hired horse the rest of the way, arriving at Hartley Plantation on the afternoon of June 5th, covered in dust and utterly exhausted. He found Catherine in the morning room, embroidering a sampler, looking as serene and composed as though nothing at all had changed. She looked up as he entered, set aside her needlework, and met his eyes directly. Neither spoke for a long moment. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Catherine finally asked, her voice perfectly pleasant. "You know I did," Thomas replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Good," Catherine said, "then we understand each other." She picked up her embroidery again, threading her needle with green silk. "Dinner is at 6, as always. The Reverend Carlyle and his wife are joining us. I trust you'll make yourself presentable." Thomas stood there a moment longer, wanting to rage at her, to demand answers, to ask how she could be so cruel. But he knew the answer already. She had been humiliated, betrayed, reduced to nothing in her own eyes. And she had the power, through law, through custom, through the system they both lived within, to strike back in a way that would destroy both men who had wronged her while preserving her own position. He went upstairs to his room. They no longer shared a bedroom, a change that had occurred immediately after Jacob's sale and that Thomas had been too defeated to question. He washed, changed his clothes, and at 6 o'clock presented himself in the dining room wearing his public face, the mask of the successful planter and community leader. Reverend Carlyle and his wife arrived promptly. Dinner was served by the house staff, who moved through their duties with practiced efficiency. The conversation ranged over various topics: the state of the cotton crop, politics in Montgomery, the new railroad line being planned, missionary work among the Cherokee. Thomas contributed when required, laughed at the Reverend's anecdotes, agreed with his theological points. Catherine was the perfect hostess, attentive to her guests' comfort, guiding the conversation with subtle skill. To any observer, the Hartleys were exactly what they appeared to be: a prosperous, respectable family, pillars of their community, living the life that their position entitled them to live. No one could have guessed at the devastation beneath that surface, the terrible secret that bound husband and wife together in mutual hatred. This became the pattern of their lives. They maintained appearances with rigorous discipline. Thomas managed the plantation, attended to business, fulfilled his social obligations. Catherine ran the household, supervised the servants, sat on the boards of various charitable societies. They spoke to each other with distant politeness. They never again referred to what had happened. But Thomas aged rapidly over the following years. His hair went from iron grey to white. Lines of worry and sorrow carved themselves into his face, far deeper than his comfortable circumstances should have warranted. He stopped attending social gatherings when he could find plausible excuses. He drank more, often sitting alone in his study late into the night with a bottle of whiskey, staring at the empty chair where Jacob used to sit when he came in the evenings on the pretext of discussing carpentry work. The study became Thomas's refuge and his prison. He kept it locked when not in use, allowed no one else to clean it. He tended it himself, dusting the books, polishing the furniture, maintaining it exactly as it had been in the spring of 1851. It was as though he was preserving a shrine to something lost, though he could never have explained this to anyone. Catherine, by contrast, seemed to gain strength and vitality with each passing year. She took on more of the plantation's management, making decisions that previously would have been Thomas's alone. She expanded her charitable work, becoming known throughout Greene County as a woman of exceptional capability and moral rectitude. When the other planters' wives gathered for their sewing circles and quilting bees, Catherine was always at the center, her opinions sought and valued. Sometimes the other women whispered about it. The way Catherine Hartley seemed to have become the true power at Hartley Plantation. The way Thomas deferred to her in matters large and small. The way their marriage seemed somehow hollow, despite its outward propriety. But no one knew why. No one suspected the truth. And Catherine certainly never told them. Twice a year, Catherine traveled to Mobile on shopping trips, always staying at the Waverly Hotel, always returning with fabric and furniture and other items needed for the household. What she did during those trips, the visit she made to 47 Front Street, the reports she received from Viola Garrison, the satisfaction she took in confirmation that her revenge continued, remained her private business. Thomas knew, but said nothing. What could he say? The Hartley daughters grew up in this atmosphere of unspoken tension and carefully maintained normalcy. Margaret the Elder married in 1859 at age 16 to a merchant's son from Tuscaloosa. It was a good match, cementing the family's position in Alabama society. Eleanor followed in 1862, marrying a young lawyer from Mobile, despite the disruptions of the war that had begun the previous year. The Civil War transformed the South, destroying the entire system upon which families like the Hartleys had built their fortunes. Federal troops never reached Greene County directly, but the economic devastation was comprehensive. The plantation continued to operate through 1864, though producing for a Confederate economy that was rapidly collapsing. When Union victory came in 1865, everything changed. The enslaved people on Hartley Plantation were freed by the 13th Amendment. Some left immediately, heading north or west to find family members sold away years before. Others stayed, having nowhere else to go, working now as paid laborers, though the wages were minimal and often paid in script rather than coin. The cotton economy that had sustained the Black Belt was shattered, would take decades to rebuild, and would never return to its antebellum heights. Thomas Hartley did not live to see the full extent of this transformation. He died in 1863, at the age of 55, of what was officially listed as heart failure. The doctor who attended him noted that Mr. Hartley seemed to have simply lost the will to live, that he had wasted away over a period of months despite having no obvious disease. Those who attended his funeral, a smaller gathering than might have been expected for a man of his former standing, as the war had made travel difficult and dangerous, noted that his widow seemed composed rather than grief-stricken, that she wore her black mourning dress with dignity but not particular sorrow. Catherine Hartley lived until 1892, dying at the age of 70, having outlived her husband by nearly 30 years. She navigated the Reconstruction era with the same skill she had brought to managing the plantation in its antebellum heyday, converting Hartley land to tenant farming, investing in the Birmingham steel industry, maintaining her family's position through adaptability rather than nostalgia for the past. She never remarried. She never, so far as anyone knew, took any particular interest in any man. Her life was dedicated to her daughters, her grandchildren, and the preservation of the Hartley name and fortune. When Catherine died in the winter of 1892, her funeral was attended by more than 200 people. She was remembered as a pillar of her community, a woman of exceptional strength and capability who had guided her family through the war and its aftermath. The eulogies praised her business acumen, her charitable works, her devotion to family. The Reverend Carlyle, elderly now but still serving the church, spoke of her as a model Christian woman whose life had been one of service and dignity. No one mentioned the spring of 1851. No one spoke of Jacob, whose name had been erased from family history as completely as he had been erased from the plantation. No one knew what Catherine had done, or why. In Mobile, Jacob had survived 6 years at the Garrison house. 6 years of mechanical service to men whose names he never learned and whose faces blurred together in his memory. He survived by the same method that enslaved people had used for centuries, by separating his mind from his body, by going somewhere else mentally while his physical form did what was required of it, by finding small moments of humanity in conversations with the other men trapped in that house, by holding on to some core of himself that could not be touched, no matter what was done to his body. In 1857, as Viola Garrison had promised Thomas, Jacob was sold to Beaumont Sugar Works outside New Orleans. The sale was conducted through an agent. Viola never dealt directly with the sugar plantations, finding them distasteful even by her standards, and Jacob made the journey downriver in chains, along with 20 other enslaved men, all being sent to work that was known to be a slow death sentence. The sugar plantation was everything the story said it was. The work was brutal, 16-hour days during harvest season, standing in water up to the knees, cutting cane, feeding it into grinders that could crush a man's arm if he slipped, working in the boiling houses where the temperature reached intolerable levels and the caustic fumes burned lungs and eyes. Men died regularly from exhaustion, from accidents, from disease bred in the swampy conditions. The owners calculated that it was more profitable to work enslaved people to death and buy replacements than to maintain them at a level that would allow for long-term survival. Jacob lasted 3 years at Beaumont. 3 years of agony that made his time at the garrison house seem almost bearable by comparison. At least there, he had been kept relatively healthy. Viola Garrison had a financial interest in maintaining her assets in good condition. At Beaumont, there was no such consideration. He was simply fuel for the machinery of sugar production to be used up and discarded. In November of 1860, Jacob died. The official cause listed in the plantation records was fever, which could have meant any of a dozen ailments common in the Louisiana lowlands. He was 37 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Plantation cemetery, one of hundreds of enslaved people who had died at Beaumont over the decades. No one mourned him. No one marked his passing. He simply disappeared from the world, another life erased by the institution of slavery. There is no record of whether anyone ever informed Thomas Hartley of Jacob's death. By 1860, Thomas was already declining toward his own end, consumed by guilt and grief and the weight of knowledge he could share with no one. It's possible he never knew that Jacob had died, that he spent his final years imagining Jacob still alive and suffering in Louisiana, still serving out the sentence that Catherine had imposed. Perhaps that ignorance was a mercy, or perhaps it was simply another layer of the tragedy. The truth of what had happened at Hartley Plantation in the spring of 1851 remained buried for more than 70 years. It emerged only because of a peculiar accident of history, the kind of random chance that sometimes reveals secrets that all involved parties had intended to remain hidden forever. In 1924, the old Hartley mansion in Greene County was being demolished. The plantation had been sold out of the family after Catherine's death, passed through several owners, and finally been purchased by a developer who intended to subdivide the land. The house itself was in poor repair, considered not worth saving, and workers were tearing it down room by room. In what had been Thomas Hartley's study, a worker removing the wainscoting discovered a sealed cavity in the wall. Inside was a metal box, painted black, about a foot long and 8 inches wide. The box was locked, but the lock was old and rusted, and the worker broke it open with a crowbar. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all in the same elegant feminine handwriting, all addressed to "My dear sister Caroline." They were arranged chronologically, spanning from May 1851 to August 1854, each carefully dated, and they told, in meticulous detail, the entire story of Catherine Hartley's revenge. The letters had been written to Catherine's sister in Charleston, but apparently never sent. Perhaps Catherine had intended to send them and then changed her mind. Perhaps she had written them simply to organize her thoughts, to document what she had done, to have some record of her triumph, even if no one else could ever know about it. Whatever her intention, the letters had been hidden in the wall, presumably by Catherine herself, preserved by accident for 7 decades. The worker who found them could not read very well himself, but he recognized that the letters were old and might be of interest to someone. He took them to the Greene County Historical Society, thinking perhaps they might be worth a few dollars. The secretary there, a woman named Mrs. Dolores Fletcher, who had dedicated her retirement to preserving local history, read through them with increasing shock and fascination. Mrs. Fletcher immediately recognized the historical significance of the letters and the scandal they represented. She consulted with the Society's board, all elderly men who had known the Hartley family or their descendants. After considerable debate, they decided the letters were too explosive to be made public, at least not yet. They were sealed and placed in the Society's archives with a notation that they were not to be opened without board approval. But Mrs. Fletcher, understanding the importance of the documents and worried about their eventual fate if they remained in Greene County, made a copy. She sent that copy to her sister-in-law in Mobile, who worked as a librarian at the Mobile Historical Society. This sister-in-law, recognizing the letters' value, accepted them into the Mobile collection in 1925, where they remained sealed, but at least preserved and catalogued. Over the following decades, a few historians working on studies of slavery or antebellum Southern society encountered references to the letters in the Mobile archives. Some applied for access but were denied. The Mobile Historical Society maintained that the content was too sensitive, too scandalous, that living descendants of the families involved might still be harmed by their publication. The letters acquired a kind of mystique in historical circles, becoming one of those documents that everyone knew existed, but almost no one had actually read. It was not until 1983, more than 130 years after the events they described, that the letters were finally unsealed and made available to researchers. By then, all living people who had known anyone connected to the story were dead. The Historical Society judged that enough time had passed, that historical value outweighed concerns about scandal or family embarrassment. The letters revealed Catherine's mind with startling clarity. They showed her intelligence, her attention to detail, her absolute conviction that what she had done was justified. She described discovering Thomas and Jacob in the study. She explained her careful planning, the forged sale documents, the arrangement with Viola Garrison. She detailed her visits to Mobile, the reports she received, the satisfaction she took in knowing that both men were suffering exactly as she had intended them to suffer. But the letters also revealed something else, a profound bitterness, a sense of violation that went beyond simple betrayal. Catherine wrote about the limitations of her position as a woman, the ways in which she had been forced to accept powerlessness in so many areas of her life. She described her marriage as a prison, her daughters as both joy and burden, her entire existence as one of careful performance for the benefit of a society that valued her only for her ability to maintain appearances. In one letter, dated July 1851, she wrote, "Men tell us that we are the weaker sex, that we must submit to their authority in all things. They tell us this is God's will, nature's design. But they do not understand that weakness can be a weapon, that submission can mask control. Thomas thought he was the master of Hartley Plantation, but I have shown him the truth. I am the one with power now. I am the one who determines fates, and I have used the very system that was designed to keep me subordinate to destroy the men who wronged me." The letters offered no apology, expressed no regret. If anything, Catherine seemed proud of what she had accomplished. She had identified the greatest vulnerability of both men, Thomas's secret and Jacob's legal status as property, and had exploited those vulnerabilities with surgical precision. She had turned the tools of the slave system against them, using the absolute power that ownership granted to exact a revenge that was perfectly legal, completely unquestionable, and utterly devastating. Modern historians who have studied the letters debate their significance. Some see them as evidence of the ways in which the system of slavery corrupted everyone it touched, turning even its victims into perpetrators of cruelty. Catherine had been trapped by the gender constraints of her society, powerless in many ways, and she had used the only power available to her, power over enslaved people, to strike back at her husband. This made her simultaneously victim and victimizer, oppressed and oppressor. Others see the letters as revealing something darker and more specific about Catherine herself. Not just a product of her system, but a person who had discovered she enjoyed having absolute power over others, who had found satisfaction in deliberate cruelty. The care with which she had planned her revenge, the attention she paid to its continued execution, the pleasure she took in Thomas's suffering, all of this suggested someone who was not simply reacting to betrayal, but actively embracing the role of tormentor. And then there is the question of Jacob, whose voice is entirely absent from the historical record. Catherine's letters mention him only as an instrument of Thomas's sin and an object of her revenge. There are no letters from Jacob, no diary, no testimony. His thoughts, his feelings, his interior life. All of this is lost to history, erased by the institution that treated him as property rather than person. We know only the outline of his story. Born into slavery, skilled at his trade, used by Thomas Hartley in ways that were both illegal and exploitative, regardless of what emotional connection might have existed between them. Sold by Catherine into conditions designed to destroy him, and dead before his 40th birthday. Whether he ever loved Thomas, whether their encounters contained any genuine feeling, or were simply another form of coercion, whether he hated Catherine for what she did or understood her rage even as it destroyed him, these questions have no answers. What remains is a story of three people, trapped in a system that deformed all human relationships it touched. Thomas, whose desire for Jacob led him to exploit his absolute power as an owner, even as he risked everything to be with him. Catherine, whose rage at her own powerlessness found expression in the deliberate destruction of two other people. And Jacob, who had no power at all, who was buffeted by forces entirely beyond his control, who suffered and died because he had become a playing piece in someone else's revenge. The story of Hartley Plantation stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how the system of slavery allowed for acts of extraordinary cruelty disguised as ordinary business. Catherine Hartley destroyed two men using nothing but legal transactions and socially acceptable behavior. She did it so completely, so carefully, that for more than 70 years, no one even knew she had done it. The documents she left behind reveal not just what happened, but the cold calculation with which it was planned, and the satisfaction she took in its execution. What do you think about this story from 1851? Could Catherine's revenge ever be justified by the standards of her time, or was it simply cruelty answering cruelty in an endless cycle? And what about Jacob? Should we see him as a victim of both Thomas and Catherine, or is the situation more complex than that? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us if you've heard of other cases from history where the system of slavery enabled this kind of personal revenge. If you want more stories from America's hidden past, stories of power, shame, and the terrible things people do to each other when the law gives them absolute control over other human lives, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these dark corners of history that textbooks don't teach. We'll see you in the next one, where we'll continue exploring the secrets that shaped America.